The eastern coast of North America provided Europeans the opportunity to establish a new life, settle their own lands, and strive for prosperity. As the colonies grew, so did the number of plantations and small family farms. Providing cash crops to the mother country brought wealth to many families within colonial America. Though smaller farms could be maintained with the help of family members, larger plantations quickly utilized the institution of slavery to help manage their estates. Beginning at the Chesapeake and ending within the Lowcountry, colonists embraced slavery and viewed the institution as a fundamental and acceptable necessity. While slavery has been implemented across the globe, there are vast differences within the varying regions. More specifically, slavery within the Lowcountry looked different from slavery in the Chesapeake. In addition to the everyday hardships faced by slaves, female slaves within the Lowcountry experienced unique struggles. Lowcountry slavery provided financial stability for the colony of South Carolina. As the first colony to implement slavery from its inception, South Carolina proved herself vital to England through agriculture. Rice and indigo plantations spread throughout South Carolina and quickly led to an increase in the colonial slave population. Along with having a strong dependence on slave labor, South Carolina enforced a closed society within slavery. This closed society meant slaves experienced less interaction with white colonists on their plantations, resulting in the development of an autonomous culture within the Lowcountry. While slavery within the Chesapeake region experienced diversification in regards to slave labor, the majority of South Carolina plantations focused solely on rice, allowing slaves to learn and perfect specific skills. Specialized plantations not only influenced daily activities for slaves, but restricted their labor to specialized equipment and limited tasks. Examples of specialized equipment for a rice plantation would be irrigation work, handling spades and axes. Though slaves worked on specialized rice plantations, some estates incorporated livestock and depended on slave labor to care for their animals. For those plantations that had livestock, large herds of cattle were an important responsibility for many slaves. Thanks to slave ingenuity, South Carolina became the first colony within North America to develop cow pens. These pens were managed by slaves and allowed slaves to learn specialized skills in cattle herding. South Carolina plantations also contributed to specialized craft skills among slaves. Craft skills such as blacksmithing, saddle making, and canoe construction resulted in high levels of production, often on scales unmatched in the Chesapeake. Though most slaves were not familiar with growing rice specifically, their general knowledge regarding the labor and care for rice outweighed the knowledge of European colonists. Beginning in the spring, slaves began the planting process. After marking a hole with their heel, seeds were laid and then covered by dirt once again with the foot. By summer, groups of slaves moved in rows up and down the rice fields, hoeing the ground. Retaining their African culture, many slaves sang songs in unison while laboring in the summer heat. As fall began, the process of threshing and pounding the rice took place. The pounding process was often accomplished by female slaves. After placing the grains in a wooden mortar to be cleaned, it was then beaten by long pestles to remove the husk and whiten the grains. As rice plantations continued to prosper, plantation owners began to take notice of the physical toll rice harvesting had on slaves. In 1733, a designer of a rice cleaning machine noted the harmful conditions of rice pounding and blamed the harsh process for the deaths of numerous South Carolina slaves. To improve working conditions, machines were developed, such as pounding mills. Other advances included the utilization of tidewater irrigation. Using irrigation in this fashion resulted in less hoeing and decreased the amount of physical labor. However, building the necessary equipment such as irrigation ditches and gates fell on the backs of slaves. In addition to the strenuous labor, slaves were suffering from heat and other elements of poor working conditions. Some of these poor conditions came from the implementation of the new innovations, such as the floodgate. Floodgates prevented the water from moving, causing it to stagnate behind dams. Physicians in the Lowcountry claimed a strong relationship between these still waters and poor physical health. Though some colonists took these physical risks into account, the slave population and number of rice plantations continued to grow. White colonists believed Africans worked better under such harsh conditions than the Europeans, and by 1722, 25,000 barrels of rice were being shipped out of Charlestown, South Carolina annually. When not working the fields or performing specialized duties, slaves retired to their cabins and performed independent tasks. Early on in Lowcountry history, slaves retired to single-cabin dwellings or dormitories that were previously intended to house white servants. As plantations grew and needed more slaves, Lowcountry plantation owners began placing slaves in their own family houses. Though the homes were small and often resembled peasant housing, the families had individual gardens for personal use and were able to live as one individual family. Slave gardens within the Lowcountry held a variety of plants, including foods of African origin. In particular, the utilization of gourds demonstrated specialized skills as they used gourds for storing both drink and food. As slave dwellings grew in number, an autonomous community incorporating African traditions originated. Contributing to this sense of community was the distance between slave dwellings and the owner's home. Most slave dwellings in South Carolina sat 200 yards or more from the owner's home. This distance, along with independent gardens and home life, contributed to the autonomous slave communities within South Carolina plantations. Though slaves had a sense of community within the plantation, their owners asserted their authority through numerous means, including the marketplace. The market offered slave owners a powerful form of punishment and control. Slaves that consistently displayed acts of disobedience risked the chance of being sold at the market and separated from their family. The threat of being sold in an auction served owners well in trying to stifle disobedience and rebellion. However, the market was not to be utilized just for punishment purposes. With South Carolina being a slave society, hundreds of slaves would come through the harbor and be auctioned off in Charlestown. Numerous ads and broadsides were distributed throughout the city, detailing the number of slaves to be sold along with their departure information. In addition to gender and homeland information, details regarding health were provided. If slaves were entering South Carolina during a disease outbreak, advertisements clarified the slaves' health and the measures taken to avoid further spread among new shipments of slaves. While the market was utilized as a form of punishment, slave owners implemented other means to maintain order and control over their workers. Punishment for petty crimes and disobedience included whippings, brandings, and ear croppings. In more severe cases, slaves were beaten, pickled, sold at auction, or even executed. Punishment by execution was usually reserved for more violent crimes, including poisoning, murder, and conspiracy to revolt. Though slaves were treated similar no matter their gender, women were often subjected to differing levels of treatment. While both male and female slaves worked the fields, learned specialized skills, and were subjected to severe punishments, female slaves experienced unique treatment within slave society.
Female slaves had a unique role to maintaining the Lowcountry's agriculture and economy. When slaves were first brought to the Lowcountry, males outnumbered females for some time as there were more male immigrants during this period. At first, men were preferred over women, and nearly 2/3 of most slave shipments to the Lowcountry were male. However, by the 1690s, the number of each gender in the Lowcountry was nearly equal. Originally, there were more male immigrant slaves to do hard labor, such as rice cultivation. Though many women in West African provinces worked in the fields while men did such jobs as herding, European gender roles generally viewed men as more competent in doing outdoor labor. Soon, however, slave owners began seeing women as more valuable because of their experience in rice farming. In early 18th century South Carolina, slave women experimented and perfected rice growing in the wetlands. They transferred and adjusted their knowledge to help grow one of the most lucrative crops in the Lowcountry, and women from the rice coast of Africa became highly sought after. Women also became highly valued because of their ability to birth more slaves. By European standards, enslaved women began birthing children at an early age. Most of them conceived for the first time while in their late teens. The average interval between births was 27 months. One traveler to the Lowcountry stated that slave women gave birth generally every 2 or 3 years. Some women even had children once every year. On average, they gave birth to 8 children. By the early 1700s, women girls, slave girls between the ages of 13 to 16, sold best in Charlestown. Apart from being auctioned, women experienced additional humiliation on the auction block. Potential buyers would rub women and girls' stomachs to determine their childbearing potential, while some would even tear the clothes off of the women to inspect their bodies. Women who were believed to be fertile sold for a high price. Being a pregnant slave did not mean that they were exempt from their duties. The nature of rice cultivation meant that slaves had certain tasks, and when those tasks were done, they were generally allowed to have free time. Many women used this time to clean their cabins, maintain a garden, or make items to sell in Charlestown. However, women's work was by no means lighter than that of the men. Women worked in the fields, pregnant or not, from morning to night if they had to. Germaine Thibodeau stated that these women, quote, hoed, dug, and harvested rice just as the men, yet they suffered the additional burden of reproducing for the slaveholders' benefit, end quote. Even women who had more domestic tasks in the main house were at risk while pregnant, because they were on call 24 hours a day. Some slaveholders gave pregnant women lighter tasks as they came to the end of their pregnancy. However, many treated them the same as any other slave. Harvest season saw the most miscarriages, stillbirths, and infant deaths for women who were farther along in their pregnancies because of a combination of poor diets, hard labor, and exhaustion, and the weakness that came with pregnancy. Overall, other enslaved women and midwives oversaw slaves' childbirth. Some owners intervened by dictating the method of childbirth or requiring a physician to be present. However, slave women tried to maintain as much control over the process as they could. Midwives often administered medicinal herbs and adhered to cultural traditions such as handling the placenta in a particular manner or making sure that the amniotic sac remained intact and on the child's body. A month following the birth, the slave cabin that the child was born in was methodically cleaned and others executed rituals that were believed to protect the baby and prevent bad luck. Despite some intervention, childbirth had strong meanings within the African American slave culture, and the women tried to uphold its significance. Unfortunately, women were not out of danger after childbirth, and they remained under the close watch of the midwife and sometimes the slave owner for 9 days after the birth. Many were sent back into the fields in as little as 3 weeks after giving birth, often requiring them to take the child with them or leave it in the hands of their other children or elderly slaves. On some plantations, women were allowed to take breaks from their work to nurse their children a few times a day. Overall, however, though these women had the responsibility of child rearing, they had little time outside of their work to foster normal motherhood. In addition, the sexuality of female slaves was largely controlled by outside forces. Some enslaved parents attempted to protect their daughters and their innocence by avoiding discussions about menstruation, childbirth, and conception. Some women were able to hold more control over their sexuality and had happy marriages with a partner of their choosing. Many, however, were pushed into forced breeding, with another slave chosen by their master. Some masters even lent their most robust and sought-after male slaves to impregnate a female slave on another plantation. Enslaved women also lived unprotected from sexual violence. Resulting from a Virginia statute passed in 1662, colonial laws stated that the status of a child's freedom was the same as its mother's status. Therefore, a child born to an enslaved woman was a slave by the law. White slave owners could then impregnate a slave woman without having to worry that the child would ever be considered free. In addition, sexual violence against slave women was never considered rape due to their status as property. Not only was rape permissible, but whites burdened enslaved women with the fault of these sexual encounters. Though relations between whites and blacks were illegal, enslaved black women would receive the harsher punishment if caught with a white man because black women were perceived as sexually promiscuous, uncontrolled, and immoral. Gloria Brown Marshall stated that, quote, the black female, woman, or child was forced into sexual relationships for the white slave master's pleasure and profit, end quote. In addition to the slave owner, other white males on the plantation took advantage of enslaved women, which only further put women's bodies within the control of someone else. While Lowcountry slavery proved devastating for all slaves involved, women experienced a unique set of hardships because of their gender. Both male and female slaves participated in the role of rice production. However, women were subjected to harsh working environments not only because of their assigned roles, but also because they had the additional woes of pregnancy and child rearing. In addition, if sold at market, they faced humiliation and being examined as well as mental abuse, as they were often permanently separated from their spouses or children. Women's bodies were often out of their control in every aspect of their lives, from childbirth to sexuality. They were left powerless against sexual abuse and had to live with the unwanted consequences of it for the rest of their lives. Even though slavery brought prosperity to the Lowcountry, it came at the cost of a people's humanity.